Welcome to Today in History, our channel, where we dive daily into the most fascinating, weird, and mind-blowing events that have happened throughout time. In addition to our daily videos, we also delve into the lesser-known aspects of history, exploring the events and actions that have shaped our world. Today, we're exploring a lesser-known and often misunderstood chapter of history, the white slave trade. When most people think of slavery, they envision the transatlantic slave trade and the millions of Africans forcibly brought to the Americas. But there's another story that's rarely told: the enslavement of Europeans, particularly by the Barbery Pirates, as well as other forms of white slavery throughout history. This is a complex and often controversial topic, so let's dive in and uncover the truth about the white slave trade. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and let's get started. What is the white slave trade? The term white slave trade refers to the historical enslavement of Europeans, particularly during the 16th to 18th centuries. While the transatlantic slave trade is more widely known, the white slave trade primarily involved European Christians being captured by Muslim Barbery pirates and sold into slavery in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. This practice saw hundreds of thousands, possibly up to 1 million, Europeans enslaved over several centuries. However, the white slave trade is not limited to the Barbery pirates. It also includes the enslavement of Slavic peoples by the Ottoman Empire, Viking raids on coastal European villages, where they captured and enslaved locals, and even the forced labor of Europeans in colonial America and Australia. The story of the white slave trade is one of exploitation, suffering, and survival. The Barbery pirates and European slaves. The Barbary coast, located in North Africa, was home to the notorious Barbery pirates who terrorized European coastal towns and shipping routes for centuries. These pirates operated from the ports of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco, and they were infamous for their brutal raids. They captured men, women, and children who were then sold in slave markets across the Islamic world. The victims of these raids came from all over Europe, including Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, England, and even Iceland. The captured Europeans were often forced into hard labor, such as rowing in the galleys of pirate ships, working in mines, or serving in the households of wealthy North Africans. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, often facing sexual exploitation or being sold as concubines. The conditions for these slaves were harsh, and many did not survive the brutal treatment. However, some were able to escape or be ransomed by their families or religious orders, such as the Trinitarians and Mercedarians, who raised money to buy the freedom of Christian slaves. The legacy of the Barbery pirates and the enslavement of Europeans is a dark chapter in history that is often overlooked. The enslavement of Slavs and the origin of the word slave. The term slave actually originates from the word Slav, a reference to the widespread enslavement of Slavic peoples during the early medieval period. The Slavs, who lived in Eastern Europe, were frequently captured by neighboring empires, including the Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Muslim caliphates. These captives were sold into slavery across the Mediterranean, and the practice was so widespread that the word slave became synonymous with Slav. This enslavement was a major part of the economy in both Christian and Muslim lands during the Middle Ages. The Slavic people were often used as agricultural laborers, domestic servants, or soldiers. In the Islamic world, Slavic men were sometimes forced to become soldiers or bodyguards known as Mamluks. The Mamluks eventually rose to power in Egypt, even establishing their own dynasty. The widespread enslavement of Slavs continued for centuries, and it played a significant role in the history of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. This chapter of history highlights how the institution of slavery was not limited to any one race or region, but was a global phenomenon that affected many different peoples. Before we move into the next chapter, we would like to ask you for a favor. If you are enjoying the video, please support us by subscribing to our channel, click the like button, and share the video. It means a lot to us. Thank you. Viking raids and the European slave trade. The Vikings, known for their seafaring prowess and fearsome raids, were also involved in the capture and trade of European slaves. From the 8th to the 11th century, Viking raiders targeted coastal villages across the British Isles, Ireland, France, and even as far as the Iberian Peninsula. The captives were often transported to slave markets in Scandinavia or the Byzantine Empire. These raids were brutal, with entire communities being devastated as men were killed and women and children were captured and enslaved. The Viking slave trade was highly profitable and was a significant aspect of their economy. The captured Europeans, often referred to as thralls, were forced into hard labor in agriculture, construction, and household work. In some cases, they were sold as far away as the Middle East, where they were exchanged for luxury goods. The Viking involvement in the European slave trade is another example of how slavery was a widespread practice in the ancient and medieval world, affecting many different peoples. Forced labor in colonial America and Australia. While the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas, there were also instances of Europeans being subjected to forced labor in the New World. Many of these Europeans were indentured servants who agreed to work for a certain number of years in exchange for passage to the colonies. However, the conditions of indentured servitude were often harsh, and many were subjected to abuse and exploitation. In some cases, Europeans were forcibly transported to the colonies as punishment for crimes or political dissent. For example, after the English Civil War, many Irish and Scottish prisoners were sent to the American colonies and the Caribbean to work as forced laborers on plantations. Similarly, in Australia, the British government transported thousands of convicts to the penal colonies, where they were forced to work in harsh conditions. These convicts, many of whom were guilty of minor offenses, were subjected to brutal treatment and hard labor. While these forms of forced labor were different from chattel slavery, they nonetheless represent a dark chapter in the history of European colonization. The exploitation of labor, whether through slavery or other means, was a fundamental aspect of the expansion of European empires. The myths and misconceptions surrounding white slavery. The history of white slavery has been the subject of much myth and exaggeration, particularly in recent years. Some groups have used the narrative of white slavery to downplay the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, or to draw false equivalences between the experiences of white and African slaves. It is important to recognize that while Europeans were indeed enslaved in significant numbers, their experiences were often different from those of African slaves. The transatlantic slave trade was characterized by a level of brutality and dehumanization that was unprecedented in its scale and scope. Furthermore, the legacy of African slavery continues to have profound social and economic impacts in the Americas and around the world. The history of white slavery, while significant, should not be used to diminish or distract from the realities of African slavery. Understanding the history of white slavery requires a nuanced and balanced approach. It is a complex topic that touches on issues of race, power, and exploitation. By examining the history of white slavery, we can gain a deeper understanding of the global nature of slavery and the ways in which different peoples have been exploited throughout history. The end of the white slave trade. The white slave trade began to decline in the 18th and 19th centuries as European powers gained military and economic dominance over the Ottoman Empire and the Barbary states. The Barbery Pirates, who had terrorized European coastal towns for centuries, were finally subdued by European navies, particularly those of France and the United States. In 1816, the British Royal Navy launched a major attack on Algiers, one of the main centers of the Barbery pirate trade, effectively ending their power. Similarly, the United States waged the Barbary Wars, which led to the suppression of piracy in the Mediterranean. As European powers colonized North Africa and the Middle East, they imposed their own legal systems, which gradually led to the abolition of slavery in these regions. The Ottoman Empire officially abolished slavery in 1847, though the practice continued in some areas for decades. The end of the white slave trade marked a significant shift in the history of slavery, but it did not mean the end of all forms of slavery. Forced labor and exploitation continued in various forms around the world, and the legacy of slavery remains a profound issue in many societies. Understanding the complexity of slavery in history. The history of the white slave trade is a reminder that slavery was a global institution that affected people of all races and backgrounds. It challenges the simplistic narratives that often dominate discussions of slavery and highlights the need for a more nuanced understanding of this dark chapter in human history. While the experiences of European slaves were different from those of African slaves, they were nonetheless marked by suffering, exploitation, and injustice. By studying the white slave trade, we can gain a deeper appreciation of the complex dynamics that have shaped our world and the ongoing impact of slavery on societies today. If you found this exploration into the white slave trade informative and thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like us to cover. And stay tuned for more deep dives into the hidden stories of the past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.